welcome to another video here on my channel, Morbid History. Today we're gonna go into the oldest case I've ever had on this channel. It's actually from 1604. There's not much to... it was very hard to research because I only have one source for it. But it's an interesting one because you get to learn a lot about how the people back in those days saw different things differently from how we see them today, of course. I'll get into that. And yeah, crime and punishment in the 1600s in Sweden. So yeah, let's get straight into it. So, the story starts in a city in Sweden called Vadstena. It was midsummer, and here in Sweden, even back then, there was a huge festival, so there were marketplaces, a lot of people out and about celebrating the summer solstice, as it also called. But a sad thing happened, as usual in these stories. The local tax collector Hans Skräddare was found in his small cottage, hanged. Everyone were very confused about this because he was a well-respected, quiet man, liked to keep a lot to himself, and yeah, people were shocked. Why would this elderly man, without any obvious enemies, do this? It's also important to note that during these times in the 1600s, taking your own life, which in Swedish actually is the word självmord, translates into self-murder. During these times, taking your own life was seen as an affront to God and God's plan. So, taking your own life was essentially just as bad as if you murdered someone else. This meant that you could not have a Christian burial. You were excommunicated out of the Christian society, and what you would usually do is take the body out to a swamp, not even in a coffin, and just bury it there and stick a pole through the body so that the person won't return from the dead. But there was, of course, some leeway in these thoughts. If they thought that you had offed yourself due to insanity and mental distress from that, there were some leeway. You could still not be buried in the cemetery or with a Christian proper burial, but you were usually treated with a little bit more kindness. And after the important people in the city talked it through, they decided that Hans Skräddare was gonna be shown at least this kind of respect. He was not gonna get a pole through his body, and they were gonna bury him in a casket somewhere close to the swamp, but at least in solid soil. A few days later, a few priests and the town's executioner took Hans' body in his coffin. They took his body out to his resting place. When they were there, another tidbit from the 1600s, the executioner had a few perks with his job. He got to take the clothes off the person that he was taking care of, as you say. So he started taking Hans' clothes off. First, he had a jacket on. It was whole and clean. Under that, he noticed that he had a vest. And in the vest, there was a cut. Kinda strange, but he took it off. Underneath that, he had a shirt that once again was whole. And when Hans finally was there, without any clothes on, he noticed that Hans had a deep cut into his chest. He alerted the priests who came there and saw that this doesn't make sense. If he hung himself, how could he have cut himself? And why was there a hole in his vest but not his shirt? This was starting to be a bit suspicious. Probably a murder, they thought. When the priests were talking amongst themselves, they soon noticed that the executioner was pushing Hans' coffin down into the swamp, and not next to it as they had discussed. And he had also picked up a pole and was in the middle of pushing it into Hans. The priest did not manage to stop the executioner in time, and he drew the pole into Hans. By this point, the deed was already done, so the executioner placed some mud on top of Hans' coffin and left him there. The priests rushed into town and took the executioner with them in a bid to try to make sense of it all. If Hans was actually murdered and was not a självmördare, as we say, then he had the right for a trial and also a proper funeral, of course. The first person they questioned was the executioner. They asked him, why did you go against protocol and do all the things that we told you not to do? And he answered that Hans' daughter's husband was the one who told him to bury him in the swamp and place the pole through him. We can assume that the executioner was paid a fair bit of money for this trouble. So then the whole thing started rolling forward. So, let's now introduce ourselves to Hans' immediate family. There was his son-in-law Sven, his wife who has no name, Hans' daughter. I tried to find one, but couldn't find it in any protocols, so we're gonna call her Irma. And their maid, Kerstin. So, these three people were promptly brought in, 'cause there was something fishy in all this. All while poor Hans is still lounging around in his little coffin in the swamp. The first one to be questioned was the maid Kerstin. Kerstin promptly pointed fingers at Hans' daughter Irma. She said that she had heard her talk very badly of her father Hans, that they had a very infected relationship even from childhood. We can guess that times were rough during the 1500s when Irma must have been brought up. So, and we have really no idea what started this hate from Irma's side towards her father. But it is known from the protocols that she had once said, I'm gonna read in Swedish and place a translation here. To her father she said, har varit ond mot mig i min ungdom. Jag ska nu vara ond mot dig i din ålderdom. This, of course, placed lots of suspicion onto her. Did she kill her father out of spite, anger? And then there's Sven, the son-in-law. Why had he told the executioner to go against what the ruling people in the town had said, to give Hans a proper burial? More proper than any självmördares funeral would have been. There was something fishy going on. But both Irma and Sven refused to take upon any responsibility. They just denied. In these times, of course, we don't have the records of any evidence they might have picked up. They didn't write down their interrogations. All we know is that over the summer, after all this, they were kept in a cell with only bread and water to try and coax out a confession out of them free, but they still denied. Of course, during these days, it can't be easy to be a police officer or anything like that, if they had any. Either way, how can they actually even prove anything like this? They dug up Hans again and placed him down in the ground somewhere outside of the village. There he lies for about 3 years in limbo, just waiting. And the 3 suspects were released because they had children to take care of, so they couldn't just keep them. They were still suspects though. And even though they were free, people in the village, of course, were not really happy with them. So here comes another fun fact about crime and punishment in the 1600s in Sweden. You could actually, legally take the blame off yourself and get free from suspicion if you had 12 people backing you. So 3 years after this whole debacle, Sven and Irma had taken 12 respectable people and took them to the court as witnesses of their virtue. And since this was the law in Sweden, they were released. They were just released. And not suspects anymore. Hans was still buried, just waiting in his little limbo. And his son-in-law, daughter, and the maid released. And no justice was actually done, sorry to say. This was the 1600s. In the end, even though the townspeople thought that Hans indeed had been murdered, he was already sullied by being pulled down by the executioner. The executioner in these times were seen as a very dirty person. I can make a whole video in the future about executioners in the 1600s because there's lots of information about them. But he had already sullied Hans' body, so he could no longer be taken into the Christian cemetery and all that. So sadly, in the end, he was buried in the gallows hill of the town. Or Gallibacke, as we say in Sweden. So sadly, this case, since it's from the 1600s, early 1600s doesn't have a better conclusion than that. But I thought that it was an interesting case because you get to learn a lot about crime and punishment in the 1600s, of course, and how people thought back then. I really want to know what you think. Was the daughter and his son-in-law the true culprits in this? Cause from what I read, Hans was just an old, very old man who liked to keep to himself. Maybe he was mean to his daughter. That wasn't proven. What was proven was that Irma really hated her father. I couldn't find anything about what they got out of it. Must have been a crime of passion in that case, just like out of anger and spite. Either way, what did you think? Was it any interesting? Like, because it was such a very, very, very old case, you can't really find lots of information about it, but I hope it was interesting nonetheless. Yeah. My next video will be a folklore video, because I've been doing these true crime videos now for a while. And the witch trials are coming too. It's just a lot. There's a lot of information, and I need to take it all in and really do a good one there. I think I don't want to make it like a stressed out video, or something like that. So yeah, thanks again for watching my video, and thanks to my Patreons. I'm gonna list them here. You're awesome. Whee! Kisses to all of you. Extra kisses to the Patreons. Thank you so much for supporting me and my channel. It really means a lot. I always say that, but I want to say it so many times. It means so much. And I hope you enjoy the vlogs that I post there. And yeah, I'll see you again next week with another video. Bye bye!